The intrepid state-of-the-art warship sliced through the void of space, its engines humming with a soft, steady rhythm. The vast emptiness of space, stretching on all sides, the crew went about their duties, unaware that something was waiting for them at the edge of the uncharted system. It began with a faint signal, just a few flickers on their radar. At first, the signal was dismissed as nothing more than interference from nearby asteroids or a random cosmic event. The sensors were highly advanced, but even they had their limits. But then the signal began to grow stronger. The patterns shifted into something that felt almost purposeful, a series of bursts that almost seemed to speak in a rhythm, as if trying to communicate. Captain Juno Kessler stood in the bridge as the first message was decoded. Her fingers brushed the controls as she watched the data unfold on the screen. The words were fragmented, primitive at best, but unmistakably deliberate. This wasn't a random anomaly, but a clear signal, one that had been carefully constructed and sent across the vast emptiness of space, a warning perhaps, or a call for help. But the message was not in any known language, and the decoding team struggled to make sense of it. It didn't take long before the crew knew they had stumbled upon something far more significant than a passing cosmic disturbance. A sharp buzz echoed through the bridge. The voice of the communication officer broke through the quiet hum of the ship. Chief Communications Officer Lana Mitchell's face was lit by the glow of her console, a frown forming on her lips. "Captain, I think you need to see this," she said, her tone thick with caution. Juno approached quickly and peered over her shoulder. The message had been broken down into readable segments, but still made no sense. Then, with a sudden shift, the text reformed in front of them. Two words stood out above all the rest. "They are coming." It was brief, but the urgency was undeniable. Something was happening on that planet below, and whatever it was reaching out into the void, trying to make contact with anyone who might listen. Captain Kessler's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the viewscreen below them, a lush green world covered in thick jungles and towering mountains. It seemed peaceful from this distance, a far cry from the warning the signal had implied. But then again, appearances were often deceiving. "Do we deploy a landing party, Captain?" The voice of First Officer Ria Yang asked, breaking the silence, her eyes fixed on the planet, as if she could sense the danger too. Juno Kessler paused for a long moment, her mind running through the possibilities. If this was a warning, then what was it warning them about? What kind of species could send a signal like this, but remain so hidden in the shadows of space? Despite the unknowns, her decision came swiftly. She gave the order to prepare for a reconnaissance mission. She wouldn't risk leaving such an anomaly unexplored. A small landing crew was assembled quickly, 4 of the best soldiers trained in combat and survival to accompany the science officers who could analyze the planet's atmosphere and possible signs of life. The shuttle departed moments later, the crew watching from the bridge as it descended toward the unknown world below. The signal had pointed them here, but what would they find when they touched down? Juno couldn't help but feel a gnawing unease in the pit of her stomach. No one aboard the Intrepid could have anticipated what they were about to encounter or how much their lives would change. When the landing team set foot on that primitive world, the mysteries were just beginning, and the planet had already made its first move. The shuttle pierced through the thick atmosphere of the planet, its engines roaring as they fought against the gravity below. The landscape unfolded beneath them, a vast jungle teeming with life. The trees were massive, their roots twisted and gnarled, stretching out across the land like living sentinels. The crew could see rivers winding through the thick underbrush and distant mountains, rising high into the sky. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of wet earth and vegetation drifting through the open hatch as the shuttle made its descent. The shuttle settled onto the forest floor, its landing gear sinking slightly into the soft ground. As the doors hissed open, the crew disembarked, silently moving in a tight formation. The team was made up of 8 soldiers and 2 scientists, each equipped with advanced scanning devices, weapons, and survival gear. They were ready for anything, but there was a strange sense of unease among them. As they stepped onto the alien soil, the air felt thick, almost oppressive, like the planet was watching them, like it knew they were intruders. Captain Kessler led the way, her eyes scanning the jungle around them. Every movement, every sound felt heightened, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Her fingers brushed the hilt of her weapon instinctively. There was something unnatural about this place, something that set her senses on edge. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the underbrush thickened, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, the calls of strange creatures echoing from all directions. Yet the jungle seemed empty, in a way too like something was waiting to reveal itself. Then they heard a rustling sound just beyond the trees, followed by a low growl. That hairs on the back of Kessler's neck stood on end. She motioned for the team to hold position. Her hand lifted in a silent signal to stop. The group froze, every eye locked on the jungle around them. The growl came again, this time louder and closer. Something was out there watching them. Kessler signaled to the soldiers to spread out. They moved in sync, each step calculated as they fanned out through the trees. Suddenly one of the soldiers froze, his body tense and rigid, his weapon raised slightly ahead of him. His eyes locked onto something beyond the trees. Without a word, Kessler moved to his side, following his line of sight. And there it was, the first one they saw, standing in the shadows of the trees, was a massive humanoid figure, its body covered in thick fur, its muscles rippling with power. It stood upright like a human, but far larger and more imposing. The creature's eyes glinted in the shadows, studying them with an intelligence that sent a chill through Kessler's spine. It wasn't a wild animal, it was something more. Without warning, the creature let out a deafening roar, its voice booming through the jungle as it charged toward them. Faster than they could react, one of the soldiers barely raised his weapon before the creature was upon him. The force of the attack sent the soldier crashing into the ground, his weapon spinning out of his hands. The creature grabbed him by the arm, lifting him effortlessly into the air, and before anyone could react, it tossed him aside like a ragdoll. The team opened fire, but the creature dodged with unnatural speed, its movements fluid and calculated. It seemed to anticipate every shot fired at it, as if it knew exactly how to counter their weapons. The soldiers were trained, but this thing was something else entirely. In mere seconds, the creature had closed the distance, and another soldier went down in a brutal display of strength. The battle was chaos. The team was outmatched, but they fought back with everything they had. They were soldiers, they didn't surrender, but it was clear this was not a simple hunt, this was a fight for survival. The team was in disarray. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the soldiers fired frantically at the massive primate. The creature was a blur of motion, its sheer speed and strength making it nearly impossible to track with their weapons. Each soldier tried to adjust, but the creature anticipated every move, as if it could read their minds with deadly precision. One soldier fell to the ground, clutching his side, blood seeping through his armor. The others were too focused on the creature to notice the growing number of its kin emerging from the jungle. It wasn't just one anymore, the entire area was alive with movement, and in an instant the crew found themselves surrounded by a pack of these towering figures, their eyes gleaming with intelligence, but also a terrifying hunger. As they circled the soldiers, the air felt thick with the weight of their gaze. The crew was pinned, their weapons useless against the overwhelming force they were up against. Captain Kessler's heart raced as she fired another round into the creature closest to her, but it only staggered slightly before advancing once more. She knew they couldn't win this fight, but she couldn't afford to panic either. She quickly scanned the situation, her mind working furiously as the soldiers scrambled to regroup. Then, in a split second, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and from the shadows of the jungle emerged more figures far larger than the first. The ground shook as they moved with terrifying force. These new figures were unlike anything the crew had seen before. Their bodies were even more massive, their limbs longer and more muscular. The air seemed to crackle with their sheer presence. Kessler's mind raced, trying to process everything. These weren't just primitive animals. They were organized. These creatures knew how to fight. They knew how to dominate. They weren't just defending their territory. They were preparing for something more. They had made their move, and now the humans were caught in the middle of it. Without warning, a loud roar echoed through the jungle, signaling the arrival of something even greater. Kessler's eyes widened as a massive shape stepped out from the trees, towering over the rest of the creatures. This was no ordinary primal beast. This was their leader. It moved with an eerie calmness, its eyes studying the humans with an unnerving intelligence. The creature wasn't just physically imposing, it exuded a sense of power that sent a chill down her spine. It had to be their leader. It was the one who had been directing the attacks with such precision. The soldiers hesitated now, unsure of what to do, facing not only the sheer physical power of the creatures, but their calculated strategy as well. The creature's eyes locked onto Kessler's, and for a moment it seemed to study her, as if weighing her every move. Then, without any further warning, the leader raised one massive arm, and the creatures surrounding the crew stopped moving completely. It was like they were waiting for something, like they were waiting for the order. Kessler's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. They weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far more dangerous. They were fighting for control, and the humans had unwittingly become pawns in a game that they could not hope to win. The leader's gaze never left her, as it let out a low growl, and the jungle fell into an unsettling silence. Kessler's mind was racing, but her body remained still. Her next move would decide everything. The moment of silence stretched on forever as the leader's gaze held steady on Kessler. The tension was unbearable. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, but none of them dared make a move. The massive creatures surrounding them seemed to wait for an order, like they were waiting for a signal to strike. And yet nothing happened. The jungle was still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant calls of unseen creatures. Kessler's mind raced, trying to figure out what this meant. If the leader wasn't attacking them, then why had it stopped everything? The primates were not just animals. They were calculating, they were strategic. They had set the terms for this encounter, and the humans were far from being in control. Kessler's breath came shallow as she weighed the options. They were outmatched, outnumbered, and trapped on a hostile planet where they knew nothing about the enemy's true capabilities. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, until at last the leader made its move. It stepped forward slowly, its massive form cutting through the jungle like a shadow. The soldiers instinctively raised their weapons, but Kessler held up her hand, a signal to hold their fire. She couldn't afford to start a firefight, not with this creature so close. She had to think. They had to survive. The creature stopped just a few feet from Kessler, and for a moment neither moved. The other primates watched from the edges of the jungle, their eyes unblinking, as if awaiting the outcome of this quiet exchange. Kessler swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. She didn't know what this creature wanted or what it was waiting for, but she couldn't make a wrong move. She needed to understand what was happening. The leader finally broke the silence, its voice a deep rumbling growl that reverberated through the air. It spoke in a language the crew didn't recognize. The words were guttural and harsh, but the tone carried a weight of authority and power. There was no mistaking it. This creature was no mere beast. It was the leader of a society that had been shaped by centuries of survival and adaptation. Kessler motioned for the team to remain silent. She had no idea what the creature was saying, but something told her that the answer to their survival lay in understanding it. She took a careful step forward, making sure not to show any signs of weakness or fear. As she tried to communicate through body language, her eyes locked with the creature's, as if to show that she was not here to attack but to understand. The leader seemed to consider her for a moment, its eyes flickering over the humans before it stepped back slightly and raised one hand. The other primates followed suit, all eyes now on Kessler and the team. The leader spoke again, its words slow and deliberate. The humans could only watch and wait helplessly, hoping that some part of this exchange would offer them a chance to survive this encounter. But what they did not yet realize was that this moment of stillness was not a sign of peace. It was the calm before the storm, and whatever came next would decide their fate. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as the leader continued to study Kessler. The other primates were eerily still, each one watching the captain with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They weren't just observing, they were calculating, like they were trying to decide whether she was an ally or an enemy. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling of the trees, the distant calls of creatures hidden in the shadows. It all felt like it was building up to something bigger, something Kessler couldn't yet understand. The leader's gaze didn't waver from her as it raised its hand once again, and a low murmur passed through the surrounding primates. They moved closer, but without hostility. Their actions seemed more deliberate, as though they were forming a circle around her and her team, as if they were waiting for something. Kessler felt a chill run down her spine, But she refused to let her fear show. She couldn't afford to break now, not when so much was at stake. Then the leader spoke again, its voice deep and resonant, the words still foreign to Kessler, but this time they carried a different tone. There was something almost pleading in the creature's growl, like it was asking a question, something that demanded an answer from Kessler. But what was it that it wanted from her? The captain's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something crucial to understanding the motives of these creatures. Without a word, Kessler reached for her communicator and activated a signal, hoping to make contact with the Intrepid. It was a desperate move, but she had no other options. They had to know what was happening here. They had to know what they were up against. But as the signal flickered and buzzed in her ear, a realization hit her. The communication system was down. There was no way to contact the ship. The primates had somehow jammed their signals without them. Even realizing it, they were trapped, cut off from the outside world, with no way of knowing what was happening on the ship above. Kessler cursed under her breath and turned back to face the leader. She couldn't afford to panic, not now, not when their lives were on the line. She had to keep her composure. She had to figure out what this creature wanted. She glanced at her team and saw the same uncertainty in their eyes. The soldiers were tense, their weapons still drawn, but they knew they couldn't use them. Not with the primates watching their every move. They were out of options. The leader raised its arm again, and the primates responded in unison. They moved with an uncanny precision, their actions synchronizing in a way that suggested they had been trained for moments like this. Kessler's heart raced as she realized the truth. The creatures weren't just random beasts. They were organized, they were intelligent, and they had been preparing for this moment for a long time. They had studied the humans, and now they were ready to make their move. Kessler didn't know what the primates wanted, but one thing was clear: they were in control, and the crew of the Intrepid was at their mercy. The leader lowered its arm, and the surrounding primates fell into a tense stillness, their eyes never leaving the humans. The weight of their collective gaze felt like a physical force pressing down on Kessler and her team. The jungle had gone quiet. The distant sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if the very planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Kessler's mind raced. She had to think clearly. She had to understand why they were being watched, why these creatures hadn't attacked them outright. She glanced at her soldiers. Each one of them looked on edge, their weapons still raised, but there was no real intention to fire, not with the overwhelming force of the primates surrounding them. The leader took a slow step forward, closing the gap between itself and Kessler. It towered over her by several feet, its massive form blocking out the dim light filtering through the canopy above. Its eyes seemed to bore into hers, and for a moment Kessler felt an odd sense of recognition. It was as if this creature could see right through her, like it understood her in a way that no other being had ever managed to do before. Kessler fought to keep her expression neutral. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not in front of these creatures. The leader made another sound, a low rumble in its chest. This time the sound felt almost like a question. Kessler knew it was no coincidence that it was looking at her so intently. It was waiting for something from her. But what did it want? She didn't know the language of the primates, but their intentions were becoming clearer by the second. They were intelligent, they were organized, and they were waiting for a response. One of the soldiers to Kessler's left moved slightly, his hand twitching towards his weapon. The captain held up a hand, signaling him to stay still. The last thing they needed was to escalate the situation further. The leader's eyes flicked to the soldier, and then back to Kessler, its gaze sharp and calculating. It was as though it knew exactly what they were thinking, and it was testing them to see how they would react. Kessler cleared her throat and took a step forward. She had no idea what the creature was expecting, but she knew they had to make some kind of connection if they wanted to survive. She spoke slowly, her voice steady but firm. "We're not here to fight, we're here to understand." She didn't know if the creature would understand her words, but she had to try. She needed to make it clear that they weren't a threat to them. The leader's eyes flickered as if processing her words. Then it let out another low rumble, this time followed by a series of clicks and growls that echoed through the jungle. The sound was guttural, harsh, and unintelligible, but there was a change in the air, something subtle, something different. The primates around them seemed to relax ever so slightly, the tension lifting just a fraction, but Kessler couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was still looming just beyond the surface. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, the leader stepped back, its massive form disappearing into the shadows of the jungle. The other primates followed suit, moving with practiced precision. They melted into the underbrush and vanished from sight. Kessler blinked in confusion, but before she could react, the leader reappeared, its eyes fixed on her one final time. It raised a single finger to its lips in a gesture that was somehow both commanding and almost cryptic. Without another word, the leader turned and disappeared into the jungle, the rest of the primates following in its wake, leaving Kessler and her team standing in the midst of the silent forest, stunned and uncertain. What had just happened? Why had they left without a fight? What had the leader meant by that gesture? And what would the crew face next on this strange planet? The silence that followed was deafening. The jungle felt almost too quiet as the soldiers stood frozen, their weapons still raised. But the creatures were gone. The tension in the air hung thick, like an unspoken promise that the calm was only temporary. Kessler's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the creatures retreated? Why had their leader shown such an interest in her? What had that gesture meant? Was it a warning or a sign of something else? The soldiers slowly lowered their weapons, still on edge, but unsure of what to do next. Kessler took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She turned to look at the rest of her team. Each of them wore expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. None of them had expected the encounter to end like this. After all they had seen, these creatures were not simple animals. They were intelligent beings capable of planning and executing tactics with precision. Captain Kessler motioned for the team to regroup. They needed to make sense of what had just happened and figure out what their next move was. Form up, she commanded, her voice steady and firm. The team complied, quickly falling into formation around her. They moved cautiously, keeping their eyes on the jungle as they began to make their way back to the shuttle. The jungle around them remained still, but Kessler couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the creatures were still out there waiting for something. But what were they waiting for? Her hand instinctively went to her sidearm as her mind raced through the possibilities. They had made contact with a species far beyond anything humanity had encountered before. They had no way of knowing what this planet's true inhabitants were capable of, and there was no way to tell if the creatures had simply retreated to regroup or if they were preparing for something far more dangerous. As they moved through the thick underbrush, the trees seemed to close in around them, their roots twisting and curling like living things. The air felt heavy with the sense of being hunted, and every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an answer that was still out of reach. It wasn't until they reached a small clearing that Kessler ordered them to stop. She needed to think. They needed a moment to process what had happened and decide on their next steps. The soldiers fanned out around the clearing, setting up a defensive perimeter, while the scientists began scanning the area for any signs of life or technology. Kessler stood at the center of the group, staring into the dense jungle. She was trying to piece together the puzzle of what the creatures had shown them, and what their true purpose was. She had no answers, but she knew one thing for certain: they were not alone on this planet, and whatever these creatures were planning, it involved the humans in a way that no one could have foreseen. Then, just as the team was about to begin their search for answers, there was a sound, a distant rumble like thunder rolling across the sky. But there was no storm. The sound grew louder and closer, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Kessler's head snapped around as her instincts screamed at her that something was coming, something much bigger than they had encountered before. The sound continued to grow closer and closer, and then through the dense trees ahead of them, something massive emerged, something that could only be described as a living storm. Its shape was impossible to comprehend, but its presence was undeniable, and for the first time since landing on this alien world, Kessler felt a deep and overwhelming sense of fear. The real battle was about to begin. The ground trembled with each step. The massive shape moving through the jungle with terrifying ease. Its form loomed in the distance, just beyond the trees. The soldiers quickly scrambled to take positions, but no one could hide from the sheer scale of what was coming toward them. The trees seemed to bow under the weight of the creature's approach, the air thick with an unsettling energy that made the hairs on the back of Kessler's neck stand on end. She had seen many things in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. The rumble grew louder until it became a deafening roar that shook the very earth beneath their feet. Kessler's breath caught in her throat as the creature finally emerged from the trees. It was like nothing they had ever seen. Its form towering over the soldiers, its massive limbs covered in what appeared to be thick hide. Its body was a blend of organic and metallic elements, as if it had been built rather than born. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its presence commanded a terrifying authority. The team stood frozen, their weapons raised but unsure of what to do next. The creature's gaze swept across the group, as if it were evaluating them like the leader had done moments before, but there was no sign of hesitation this time. No pause to analyze or test. Kessler could feel the weight of the creature's intelligence pressing down on her like it was studying her every movement, and thought the soldiers were tense. But they knew they couldn't engage with something so powerful, not without a plan, not without understanding what they were up against. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its every motion a display of strength and grace. The air around it seemed to crackle with energy as it closed the distance between them, its steps sending shockwaves through the jungle. The soldiers held their ground, but Kessler could see the fear in their eyes. They were outmatched, there was no question about it. But there was something else, a growing sense of realization that they were no longer in control. They were at the mercy of these creatures and the planet itself. Kessler took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had to be the leader. She had to keep the team focused. She raised her hand, signaling for the soldiers to lower their weapons just a little. They couldn't afford to escalate the situation further, not when the creature was so close. Its eyes locked onto hers once again, and she felt the weight of its gaze deep in her soul. It was as if the creature was trying to communicate with her without words, its intelligence unmistakable. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't want to fight, we don't want war, we're just here to understand." Her words seemed to hang in the air, but the creature didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly as if considering her words. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back. It raised its massive hand in a gesture that seemed to command the jungle to fall silent, and for a brief moment there was stillness. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder, as if the very sky itself was waiting for what would come next. Kessler couldn't believe what she was witnessing, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever these creatures were capable of, it was beyond anything humanity had ever encountered, and whatever happened next would determine the future of their species on this alien world. The silence hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Kessler knew that they were no longer just explorers. They were players in a game far larger than they could ever imagine.